Hi, everyone. My name is Alison O'Connor, and I am the horticulture agent for CSU Extension here in Larimer County. Really pleased to do this, so thank you to Mary for the invitation. And we're talking all about perennials tonight, so maintenance, care, culture, and then I'll also give you a sneak peek to a few of the perennials that are on trial at CSU that Dr. Klett recently made the best of. So these are the ones that you can look for this spring to add a little bit more color to your garden. So really pleased to be here, and I just wanted to give a little bit of a background on what extension is, because I think some people know about us, some people don't, and it's totally fine. It's kind of a nebulous term, but just know that we're the outreach arm of your land grant institution, which happens to be located right there in Fort Collins, Colorado State University. And every state in the nation has a land grant institution, at least one. And we are very proud to have the agricultural sector and other resources available to you. So what Extension does is we actually bring all of that wonderful information and the research that's going on at CSU back to the public that you can use in your everyday life. So if you were ever a 4-H'er, if you've ever contacted a master gardener, all of those are programs under the umbrella of Extension. And as the horticulture agent, I work primarily with backyard landscaping. I work a lot with our green industry. And then I also coordinate the Master Gardener program. So there's a ton of great information and resources. And if you ever suffer from insomnia, just visit our website. There's so much there. But really, there's a lot of resources that you can take advantage of on all sorts of different topics. So this is what we'll cover tonight. We'll start with what is a perennial, a little bit about design. I am not a landscape designer, and so I'm not going to spend a ton of time, but I'll point you to some resources that you can look, because I think sometimes that's where we get a little bit perplexed, is I like this perennial, but I'm not sure how it works with some others that I already have. Then we'll talk about maintenance, including division, which I know is what Mary really wanted everyone to learn a little bit more about. And then we'll touch on some great perennials for your landscape. And there will be plenty of time for questions, so you can either come on live and feel free to interrupt me or type it into the chat. I have that up, and I'm happy to clarify or answer any questions that you might have. So let's start it off with what is a perennial. It's a term that I think everyone is familiar with, but sometimes it gets a little bit confusing, especially when we start throwing annuals and biennials and woody plants into this. So perennials are those plants that return year after year. They're generally herbaceous, which means that they're from soft plant material, and they're usually not woody. Now, there are a couple exceptions. The first that comes to mind is lavender. Lavender technically is a perennial, but it does get a little bit woody in our climate. Generally, what happens is that these plants, they die back to the crown, and then they regrow from that crown during the next growing season. So they come back year after year, generally regrowing from the crown. They usually have a set bloom time, and so it's pretty reliable. You can count on your daylilies to bloom in July and August. You can count on your creeping phlox to bloom in the early spring. They don't have as long a bloom period as our annuals, like our petunias or our zinnias. Those tend to bloom all summer long, but our perennials do usually give us at least 4 to 6 weeks, if not longer. And so they're great plants, and I like to think of them as economical. They're plants that you put in the ground, and then they come back year after year. You don't have to invest a lot of resources except for your own time in terms of maintenance. Couple common perennials that everybody can see, and I'm sure everybody thinks of a perennial that comes to mind. A couple of my favorites, of course, are peonies. We would consider those a perennial. Bleeding heart, those remind me of my grandma. My grandma grew the most amazing bleeding heart in Minnesota. It was fantastic. But also coneflowers, sedums, iris are a great perennial. Hosta, which can grow in Colorado if given the right conditions, but definitely not one of our xeric plants, which just means more water-wise. But the great thing about perennials is that if you've moved to Colorado from a different location, so I'm from the Midwest, we have a lot more rain, obviously, than we do here in Colorado. When you move to Colorado, sometimes you feel like your plant palette is a little limited, that you can't grow everything you want, or those plants that remind you of childhood or that you've always had in your landscape. And what's great about perennials is that there's so many options. There's great color options. There's great ones that can do better in sunny situations. There's amazing pollinator plants. And so we really do have a lot of diversity when it comes to perennial plants in Colorado. The benefits of perennials are numerous. So again, you plant once and you can enjoy them for years. They come back reliably year after year if in the right conditions, and they generally have that long period of bloom, so 4 to 6 weeks. Sometimes you can cut them back and you'll get a second set of blooms, which is always nice as well. Their roots, because they're in the soil permanently, are going to benefit your soil. So that's something that I think all gardeners in Colorado like to maybe complain about a little bit, is how bad our soils are, but just know that perennial plants will help with organic matter. They'll help break up some of that heavy clay. And so those roots do a lot of benefit for our soils in addition to supporting the plant. And there's perennials in all shapes, colors, sizes, and textures. And so one thing I always like to talk to people about, and this is a good design tip, that if you're adding some perennials to your garden, take a photograph with your phone and convert it to black and white, and then look at the plants. You know, do you have different textures in there? Do you have different height differences? Or is everything kind of the same? So when I moved into my house here in Windsor, I really got to start over with a blank slate. What was here originally was not really what I was digging. The house was built in the 80s, and so I did some pretty major renovations. But what I found is that everything I picked out was small, yellow flowered, and about the same height. And so I really had kind of a dilemma. So that black and white photograph trick is really good, and you can start to get then a little bit of diversity in your textures and heights and things like that. And as we're moving to more sustainable water use, just know that the diversity of plants that's available that can thrive on little or no supplemental water once established, there are so many plants out there. And we're really fortunate that we have a good selection of native plants, but we also have these introduced plants through programs like Plant Select, which I'll talk to you a little bit about. Because we have similar climates to other areas of the world. So we're getting some really neat introductions that do well in our arid climate. So the diversity is really nice. Plant Select, if you haven't heard of it, and hopefully you have, it's a cooperative program with Colorado State University, the Green Industries of Colorado, and then Denver Botanic Gardens. So there's these 3 entities, and they all work together to not only scout and select plants, but then these plants also go through a pretty rigorous research perspective in many different demonstration gardens to look to see how they perform at 8,000 feet. How do they perform in a really dry climate? How do they perform with some supplemental irrigation? Are they pollinator friendly? Are they invasive? So a lot of these plants get put through the ringer, if you will, and then the best of the best then get introduced through the Plant Select program. It's been around for just over 20 years, and there's been some amazing introductions, and then every year they also introduce some new plants into the trade. So these are plants specifically selected that do well in the high plains in the arid west, which is Colorado. They would extend up into Wyoming. They could go west over into Utah, a little bit down into New Mexico, Arizona. But just know that these are great choices. And they are all xeric, which means that they are water friendly. And then again, after that initial period of establishment, really don't need any supplemental irrigation or very little. The website is plantselect.org, pretty easy to remember. This is just a screenshot of the front page of the website where they're introducing some of the 2021 plants. I believe that there's 5 that have been introduced below. There's some really neat ones and some ones that I think you should try. So these are not plants that would be available at a box store like Home Depot or Lowe's, but you would have to go to an independent garden center. So in Fort Collins, Gullies, Fort Collins Nursery, Fossil Creek, Bath, they would all carry these plants, and they usually are grouped in a location where they're together with some of their other friends. But what I wanted to point out is this really, really handy plant finder through the website. So if you go to the main page and then click on plants, that's one of the tabs along the top, you can then click on find a plant, and this is a really fun feature. So let's say you have an area by your mailbox that is next to your neighbor's yard that's full sun, and you want a plant that is pollinator friendly, maybe gets to be 24 inches tall and has multi-season appeal, whatever those are. On the left, there's a lot of different boxes that you can check for these specific plants. Maybe you have dry shade. Maybe you want something that only has pink blooms or yellow blooms. You can do all of that. So on this section, I just did a screenshot of the attributes. So we're looking at something that attracts bees. Maybe you have deer issues or rabbits, who doesn't, right? Those are all options that you can do. Attracting hummingbirds, edible fruit, which would be more for animals, not necessarily for humans. But then it will give you a list of plants, and you can scroll through, look at the pictures, and decide that's what I want for my garden, or maybe there's something else. And then you can take those recommendations and go to the garden center and pick them up and introduce them into your landscape. So it's a great feature. I think sometimes we're like, oh, what can I plant that's different for XYZ location? And this is a really nice feature. Also on the Plant Select website is the design feature. So the find a plant, again, is under plants. The design feature here, if you click, there are pre-made designs that you could take advantage of if you have no idea what goes together, how to put things together. And these are actually incredible designs by some of our more famous designers in the Colorado area. So many of you maybe heard of Lauren Springer. She's done a number of designs at the Gardens on Spring Creek and also has a number of books. There's some others from other designers in Fort Collins and the Denver area. And so it gives you the plants, what you need to buy, how many you need to buy, how to space them, and then it does the work for you, which is really great. Another really handy website is the Resource Central website, and I can put that into the chat in a little bit, but they do the Garden in a Box program, and maybe you've heard of that. It's actually a program that a lot of water utility cities with water utilities work with. So I know Windsor is, Fort Collins, Loveland, and Garden in a Box is very similar to this, where you have this pre-made design that you can then plant in your landscape. And it will tell you how many square feet it is, so you can kind of estimate for your own landscape. Did someone have a question that I can answer? Okay, so Garden in a Box, you can also just Google that. Plant Select is great. So those are two really good resources. And then in terms of plant materials, CSU Extension, of course, has long lists of plants. So we have ground covers, we have perennials, we have plants for mountain communities. So there's a lot of different resources that you could take advantage of. With design, this is basically my one slide on design because, again, I'm not a landscape designer, but I will say that when you're looking to incorporate plants into a current landscape, really think about the water use of those plants. So we always recommend that you hydrozone. What that means is you're just grouping plants with like water needs together. So that would mean that you're not putting something like vegetables that need routine water next to a Plant Select plant that might need water once a month, if ever. So you really need to think about some of those things. So instead of maybe going to the garden center and being wooed by everything pretty, which is really what happens to the best of us, we buy things and then we don't necessarily think about how we're going to incorporate them into our landscape once we get home. So that is a good thing to have an idea in mind before you go to the garden center. So if you do have space for peonies, that's wonderful. Just know that peonies are going to need more water than some of the more xeric plants. Perennials are great because they're going to mix well with trees and shrubs, vegetables, but just know that you might need to pinpoint some of your irrigation accordingly. So if you have drip already established in some of your landscape beds, you could either change out the emitters to make them more water or less water, or maybe you change your irrigation system, or if you're doing more of a xeric, you might not need even routine irrigation and you might just decide to water by hand when it's necessary. And then also plan and plant for the mature plant size. I know that sometimes when you get either a 4-inch pot or a 1-gallon pot and you put it in the landscape, it doesn't look like much. But remember, some of those are going to spread to potentially 36 inches or more. So you do want to plant accordingly. I've seen a lot of landscapes where they might be overplanted because we get anxious, right? We want instant everything, and we don't necessarily give them the time to grow in, but do make sure that you're spacing them accordingly. But that water needs thing is really, really huge, and make sure that you're hydrozoning properly. And you can have it all. I should say that you can have a lawn, you can have perennial beds, you can have vegetable beds. Just understand that they're going to need different amounts of water. Color is huge, and everybody has an opinion about color. My former director hated pink. Anything pink, she would just immediately poo-poo. Pink was not her thing. I love pink. I think it's great. But just know that when you are designing with perennials, know that those warm colors, the yellows, the oranges, and the reds, those are going to be the ones that are most obvious in the landscape. So I once read that yellow is the color that's most easiest to be seen. And so those who might have eye issues or maybe don't have as sharp of like a color observation, yellow is the color that people can see the easiest. And so when I made the mistake in planting my garden where I had all yellow, it was really, really impactful. I mean, you could see the garden from a mile away. But just know that those warmer colors are going to be more obvious. Those bold colors then should be set off perhaps by more white or silver, or even foliage green plants like hostas and things like that, if you can work those in. So they kind of tend to mute those bolder colors a little bit. The greens, the blues, the purples, they're going to recede into the landscape. This is where maybe if you have 2 gardens, you have the warmer colors where you have your coffee in the morning, and you have the blues and purples where you maybe have a glass of wine at night because you're going to relax and maybe take a step back from the world. But just know that it's all subjective. If you think of the English gardens, everything is together. It's a total hodgepodge mix of every color, and this is where color gets really personal and what you want in the landscape. In terms of combining colors, go back to that color wheel and look at those complementary colors. So yellow and purple go beautifully together. One of my favorite combinations is the coreopsis, which is the yellow, that's the one pictured there, with lavender, or even Russian sage if you want that in the landscape. But those 2 color combinations look great. So we have a more vibrant color and one that's a little bit cooler. Red and green, obviously, we have red and green in one of our major holidays, and so those go well together, and then orange and blue. So you can be a true Broncos fan by bringing those colors into your landscape. And then plants with small flowers, make sure you try to plant those more en masse, and that just means multiple plants together to really make a show. So tick seed, coreopsis, that's the one featured there, really tiny small flowers, while on the other side, like a hardy hibiscus, you would want to set that off and really have it in a prominent spot where it can be more of a specimen or a focal point. So not only think about the foliage, but also think about the flower shape and the color when you're putting these plants into the landscape. In terms of planting, perennials are pretty darn easy. Usually you just pull it out of the pot. Again, these are herbaceous plants, and so those roots are going to be nice and tender, and you can usually rough them up pretty easily with your fingers. So this is called teasing. You could use a knife or something, but if the roots are circling from the container itself, make sure that you do break them up. I know it sounds like the actual noise of you ripping roots apart probably hurts your heart a little bit, but also know that this is the best thing you can do for the plant, because every time those roots are split apart, they're going to form new roots from those cut points. So really do make sure that you rough them up. And then you're going to dig your hole according to the size of the container, and then just replant it right at the same soil level that it was in the pot. So make sure that it's deep enough, make sure that it's wide enough, and then do rough up those roots. And I would say that for the most part, you really don't need to fertilize at planting. Now, if this is something that has worked for you in the past and you swear by it, or it's something that you're a former neighbor or grandma recommended that always put in XYZ when you plant, go ahead and do that. But for the most part, understand that these plants get a lot of fertilizer at the nursery so that they look really good, and that's going to carry over into the landscape. So fertilizer at planting really isn't necessary. I would also say that for a lot of our native plants and some of the more plant select, the water-wise plants, they don't need a lot of fertilizer. They actually prefer to live life a little more lean. And so heavily fertilizing can actually affect their growth, and they might not perform as well for you in the landscape. Caring for our newly planted perennials, regardless of the type of plant, if they're native, if they're xeric, if they're water-wise, if they're plant select, those plants will need regular water for the first season. So don't think that you can plant it, water it once, and then leave it to the elements to survive. So make sure that you're letting that plant get regular water in order to get established. After that first season, then you can start to treat it as its normal habitat would provide. Do watch your watering though. So if you are not the person applying the water with a hose, check your drip system, make sure that your plants aren't drowning, make sure that the water is actually draining, and make sure that you are monitoring that. So if you're using drip, it doesn't mean that you need to water them every single day. It might be 2 or 3 times a week, but you're going to need to monitor that and get to know your system. And then again, after that first year, make sure that you are adjusting the drip to make sure that you're not watering as you were when those plants were young and getting established. Mulch is going to also be your best friend. We love recommending mulch in extension. It seems like we have a share of the company with mulch, but we don't. But wood mulch is a really good thing. If there's a way that you can use it, it's going to be great for your perennials. Some of these plants do, though, prefer pea gravel or squeegee, which is just really small sized gravel. The big cobble or the river rock, it's a little bit hard to work in, and it's not the best for overall plants. And so I would say that if you have plants that do prefer more of a rock mulch, try to go with a smaller stone size for that. It's going to provide better drainage, and some of those plants really like that heat, but then there's other plants that prefer a wood mulch. So this might take a little bit of trial and error depending on what you're growing. And the big thing with perennials is that it does take them a while to establish. So the moniker is the first year they sleep. So you plant them, they kind of sit there. They don't do a lot. They're kind of boring. But what they're doing is actually putting resources into getting their roots established. The second year they creep, and so they will put out some flowers. They'll put on some top growth. They'll start really, again, putting more resources into the roots. And then the third year, they leap. So perennials really are a 3-year investment to get them to the point where they're going to perform for you in the landscape and be as showy as the photographs that you see. So this is actually a book from a gentleman who had a Nebraska garden. I just really liked how it showed how much space there is that first year. And so things, again, look a little bit empty. The second year they creep, and then the third year, holy moly, you have a garden. So just know that it does take some time. And those small plants, those little 2-inch or 4-inch plants, they will grow just as well as something that's in a 1-gallon or even a 2-gallon container. It just takes them longer, but just know that it takes about 3 years. Are there any questions so far that I can answer? I don't see anything in the chat. If you have a question, please unmute yourself. Happy to answer. Give you a second. Okay, I'll check back with you, make sure. So we'll move into perennial maintenance next, and this is the big question. What if you need to divide or move your plant? So division just means chunking your plant up into smaller bits, and then of course moving them means moving the entire clump somewhere else. So the general rule of thumb is that if you have spring blooming perennials, so those are the ones that are going to bloom anytime between now and maybe through the middle of May, you would divide or move those in the summer. So think of iris. Iris are going to pop in the next couple months. You don't want to divide them when they're in bloom because it's a very stressful thing to actually put out a flower. And so we recommend that you divide your iris in late July or August. Conversely, those plants that bloom in the summer, such as maybe fall phlox or sedum, which is the one featured here, you can actually divide those now in the spring as the new growth is starting to emerge. So that is the general thing. So it's good to know and understand when the plant is going to bloom and then divide accordingly. And do you have to divide your perennials? No, you don't. You can leave them. If they're happy, if they're growing well, if they fit into the space where they were planted, you can leave them be. Division is really only necessary if they've outgrown everything and they're out of control. Then it's a good thing to do to kind of keep them in check. If you've noticed that flowering is reduced, and so this can happen a lot with iris, is that, you know, for 5 years you have amazing blooms, and then maybe years 6 and 7 you're not getting quite as many. Division actually kind of rejuvenates the plant and encourages them to not only put on new growth, but then put more resources back into flowering. So if flowering is reduced, that's a good time to divide. The classic is when you have dead spots in the middle of your ornamental grasses, as seen here, or let's just say you want to share plants. I have a wonderful master gardener who lives north of Fort Collins, and every time you visit her property, you go home with plants. That is just what she does. So she doesn't necessarily follow these rules of division. She will just take a shovel and she will hunk out a chunk of plant and give it to you, and you're on your way. It's amazing. I love her so much. But really, a lot of gardeners love to share their other plants, and so it's a way that we can, you know, support each other in our communities. Okay, and Christy, I'll get to your raspberry question in a little bit. So some spring blooming perennials, this is going back to when you divide. So iris, bleeding heart, brunnera, that's the one up here with those beautiful periwinkle flowers. Hellebores, if you haven't introduced hellebores into your garden, you really need to. They're also called the Lenten rose. They are one of the earliest blooming perennials next to our spring blooming bulbs that you could plant. They are amazing. They are so cute. Highly recommend them. Creeping phlox and then pig squeak or Burgundy are also spring blooming perennials. Some of our summer bloomings are coneflower, Shasta daisy, black-eyed Susan, coral bells, or heuchera. If you have some shady spots, and these actually do well in dry shade as well, but coral bells are all the rage, and I actually have a small selection of coral bells that I'm trying to grow as more of a demonstration garden. So I have like maybe 15 to 20 different types because they have amazing names like blackberry crumble and peach melba, and they just, the names alone make you want to plant them. So that's what I do, is I plant them. Tickseed is another one, the coreopsis, and then the yarrow. Those are all spring or summer blooming perennials, so you could divide those now in the early spring. Ornamental grasses, it's just understand that there's cool season and warm season. So just like we have cool season and warm season lawns, Kentucky bluegrass is a cool season lawn, buffalo grass is a warm season lawn. And they will do better when they're divided according to when they tend to put on growth. So our cool season ornamental grasses like our dwarf blue fescues, blue oak grass, reed grass like Carl Forrester, if you have Carl in your garden, they're best divided in early spring. So they're starting to put up some growth now, so you could actually divide those. The warm season grasses aren't going to green up until usually end of May, early June, mid-June, somewhere around there. So you could wait and divide those a little bit later in the spring. So blue grama, this is Blonde Ambition. It's a Plant Select plant. Highly recommend this one. It's about 3 feet tall. It has these little mustache-like flowers. Amazing. Love her so much. If you've ever been to Costco in Timnath, you will see Blonde Ambition planted in their parking lot beds right when you drive in. Some other ones, miscanthus, so silver reed grass, switchgrass, those are all warm season, so you could wait a little bit to divide those until later. The steps to division are pretty simple. So the first is dig up the entire plant. It's easier when you have some moisture in the ground. And so I was doing that this weekend. This was the lamb's ear that just was out of place. I didn't really like where it was. So the steps to division, if you have good soil moisture, that's a good thing. If it's in the middle of the summer and we haven't had rain for 2 months, you might want to give it some water for a week before you try to divide because it will save your back. So dig up the entire plant and pop it out of the ground. And then you're going to remove any dead sections. And so this is a classic ornamental grass. This was a silver reed grass. And so if you've ever tried to divide ornamental grasses, it is a battle of your strength. They are so deeply rooted and they are so, they're just tough. But dig up as much as you can, and then you will chunk out those sections. So you want to get rid of everything dead in the middle of the plant and keep everything that's still alive on the outer perimeter. Then you're going to cut them into sections, and you can make them as big or small as you wish. So these were maybe 6-inch sections, and you can use a shovel, so you can actually jab the sections with a shovel. You could use like a machete type knife. Whatever you use, just please be careful, because this is a test. Again, it's a lot of work, and just know that you can get hurt if you're not careful. So chunk it up into as many sections as you want, but I would say that the sections themselves should be at least 4 to 6 inches wide. So think about maybe the size of a 1-gallon container. That's about how big they should be. And then what you can do is replant one of the sections back in the original spot. It's going to look lonely and small because it's so much smaller than what it was. And then you can give away the other sections or move them to other parts of your garden. This is the great thing that you can share with your neighbors. You could have a plant swap on your HOA and neighborhood sites on Facebook. You could do that. Nextdoor is a great place to get rid of plants. I see them all the time coming through. But just know that that's a great thing to do. Or, if worst comes to worst and it's not a plant that's very desirable, compost it. That's okay too. And the big thing is that following transplanting and doing this process, make sure that you are watering these plants. So they are back to being a new plant in the landscape, and you do need to make sure that you're watering them appropriately. So that means putting investments into water for that next growing season to get them really well established. And here's the thing, is that sometimes division works. A lot of plants do really well. Other times it doesn't work so well, but you can always try and see how it goes. And if it's successful, that's amazing. And if not, hey, it gives you opportunity to buy something new for your yard. Moving on to a couple other maintenance things is that cutting your plants back for a second bloom can really encourage another nice flush of color in your garden. So a lot of perennials, if you cut them back hard, and what that means is that you are probably reducing the plant by about half. After the first set of blooms, it will generally send up a second flush. It won't be as big of blooms or as many as the first time, but again, it will give you a second flush. So you might get a first set of blooms in June, you cut the plant down by half, and you'll get another set usually in late July or August. So it takes a while for those plants to regenerate, but you can get that extension of bloom time. A lot of perennials, they sometimes get a little bit leggy and a little tired as we get through the gardening season too. So it helps keep them more tidy. Another option is, of course, to always just deadhead. So remove the spent flowers if you don't want them, or they're looking unsightly. That's a great way to do it. But removing those flowers and preventing them from going to seed will usually encourage additional blooms, because for the flower to complete its life cycle, by blooming, then going to seed, it takes a lot of resources. By cutting that back, the plant can then put resources into either another flush of blooms or putting it into those blooms already on the plant or coming on the plant to make them a little bit bigger and better. Perennials that will generally rebloom after cutting back, again, this is generally will rebloom. Shasta daisy are one. So Shasta daisy, once they are done flowering, those common white daisy, they just look kind of blah. The flowers turn brown, they look kind of mushy, and so giving them a clip back will actually rejuvenate them, and you'll get a second set of blooms. Salvia, or a lot of the sages, are going to do a second set. Catmint is a great one, and catmint sometimes can get a little bit floppy. So giving it a haircut and a trim will do great things. This is lavender. The second set of blooms on lavender may or may not happen. So just realize that. But If you do want to try for another second set of lavender, you could give it a cut back by about half, and then coreopsis as well, or tick seed. Now with maintenance, should you do fall or spring cleanup? Now, this is totally up to you and how you feel in the fall. I think a lot of times we're just tired. You know, I want to sit on the couch and watch football. That's just me. And now this weekend, I spent all day yesterday cleaning up my garden, and I wish I hadn't spent so much time watching football. I'll be honest with you. I wish I had done a little bit more in the fall because it was a lot of work, and my poor body feels muscles that haven't been activated in like 2 years. So leaving your plants in the fall, this is a benefit of leaving your plants, is that as the plants die back, it can actually create more surface area for snow to collect upon. And that's a good thing. So snow obviously adds some moisture, but it also acts as a good insulator for the plants. So especially those perennials that might not always survive the winter, this can be a good thing because it almost acts like a mulch. The other nice thing is that some plants like coneflowers or ornamental grasses, they provide food and also safe spaces for birds during the winter months. So nesting materials and other things like that. Now, some people love the look of coneflowers during the winter months. This was in my garden. Other people think that it just looks terrible and they remove them. It is, again, completely up to you. Just know there's pros and cons on both sides. I would say that the ones you should leave standing are the coneflowers because they actually have a good source of food for birds, which is scarce during the winter months a lot of time. The sedums, especially the tall sedums, look really, really nice. And so if you think of autumn joy, that's kind of a taller sedum, their flowers are usually very stout and can support a lot of the winter weather that we get. So that's a good choice. Ornamental grasses, so this is northwind switchgrass, absolutely beautiful, especially when it gets frosted or it gets backlit by the winter sun. Outstanding. And those provide a lot of really good structure in the garden. Black-eyed Susan, coral bells, they're a little smaller, but they retain their color through the winter months. And so when we don't have snow, it provides a little bit of color on the ground. The ones that I would recommend that you cut them back, and this is what I'm going to do this year, are daylilies, because after the first couple frosts, they just turn to brown mush. Brown mush doesn't look good in the winter, and so that is a good one to cut back. Iris do the same thing. So the iris leaves lose their nice sword-like shape and they just flop over. So cutting back your iris and getting those close to the ground will save you some headaches come springtime. Catmint, bee balm, your peonies, usually by September or October, your peonies look terrible because they're full of powdery mildew, and so they don't look good, so you can cut those back as well. And then your columbine. So columbine, they dry out really fast and they snap off, so that's a good one that you can cut back in the fall. Right, and then the last section here is just the best of some of the CSU perennials. So Dr. Jim Klett is our landscape horticulturalist at the university. He's been with CSU for over 40 years, and he has a very active research program. And so I'm sure most of you have visited the annual trials, which are located on Remington Street, right by the Center for the Performing Arts. Well, with the stadium moving to campus, our perennial gardens were actually moved to the north side of the Center for Performing Arts, so right at Pitkin and Remington. The perennial gardens look amazing, so if you haven't visited there, they kind of call it the garden district now. So it's just west of campus, so north of Prospect and then just west of campus. It's a beautiful area, but also right in front of the Center for the Performing Arts, there are the CSU Perennial Trials. So we have the perennial garden, which is demonstration, and then we have trials where companies actually pay to have their plants on trial to see how they do. So these perennials haven't been introduced to the market, but they spend 3 summers in the trial and 2 winters to get a really good idea of how they perform. Measurements and photographs are taken monthly to document how they do. They look at survivability during the winter months. They look at pollinator potential. So there's a lot of great aspects about having these plants. So the first one that really did well in the trials was an Echinacea, so a type of coneflower that's Sombrero Tres Amigos. And so this is a tricolored coneflower. So the individual flowers were not tricolored, but there were 3 different colors on each plant. So they called it an evolution of color that had shades of peach to burgundy. And I have a photo, don't worry. But the colors were really vibrant. And what's nice is that they didn't bleach out with our hot summer sun. They did really well. So they kept this really nice saturated color. Like all coneflowers, they had a really long period of bloom and an overall good show of height and color. The other nice thing was that the branching habit was really strong. So sometimes with these introduced Echinacea, you can sometimes get weak branching where they might break. This plant did really well. So that's Echinacea Sombrero Tres Amigos. And again, you can see the 3 different color types. And so there's some that are more peachy. There's one that's more peachy, some that are more lavender like the true coneflower, and then some that are more magenta. So look for this one on the market coming up. I think I have one more photograph of this. So again, great height, very uniform. So I believe there are 10 plants that are planted in each research bed. So again, height and uniformity is a big thing. So Sombrero Tres Amigos. The next is a Penstemon, and we have lots of different Penstemon in Colorado, and there's several that are also that are native. So Penstemon are always a really good choice. So I realized that I just missed a couple questions. So Christy, I'll get to your question right now. Our coneflowers all started out different colors, but now they're all pink. What causes that? So unfortunately, when breeding goes into some of these plants, the strongest gene may take over. And so that's probably what happened, is that the traditional coneflower color is that kind of pinky lilac color. And so this can happen also with columbine, where you might plant fancy columbine, but they all then revert to gold, which is the most dominant gene. So I'm guessing, Christy, that's what happened with your coneflower. So it's still beautiful. Hopefully you can still enjoy that. But yes, unfortunately, sometimes breeding reverts back, and that's really a bummer. And I will get to your peony question and your raspberry question when I'm wrapping up with this. So Penstem and Dakota Burgundy, back to this Penstemon. I love Penstemon. There's a lot of different types. There's several introductions too from the Plant Select Program. They are amazing pollinator plants. Some of them attract hummingbirds, and they're nice because they're pretty tall. So that's really nice. This one had burgundy foliage, so like a dark purple foliage, and then a lilac blossom. So what's great is that that burgundy foliage color looked nice even when it wasn't in bloom, but that contrast of the light lilac with the burgundy really made things pop. The blooms were very prolific. They bloom for a long period. And the best part is that 100% survival on these plants for those 2 winters. So these are being introduced as the best ofs from 2020. So they would have gone through a winter in 2019 and 2018, which in Colorado, what's a typical winter anymore? No one really knows, but they were 2 of the driest winters on record. So that's a good thing that we had really good survivability. So this is Penstemon Dakota Burgundy. So again, you can see that burgundy foliage color, that lilac blossom. And I tell you, this is absolutely outstanding. So a super pollinator plant. I think this is one, I think Penstemons have a place in everyone's garden. And this would also be on the lower water use spectrum as well. So really a nice Penstemon introduction for Colorado. Salvia Blue Bayou, which I think is a fun play on the words. This is one of our ornamental sages. And the salvias, if you know Salvia May Night, it's one of the really common salvias that we have, and it tends to have more of a purpley flower. Well, this one was more of a blue flower. So I think sometimes we want so badly to have those blue flowers, and so we plant vinca, or we plant the brunnera to get, or the plants like that to get the blue. So this kind of fills that niche, but it blooms late into the summer and all season, like a very, very long period of bloom. The first bloom generally shows up in June, July, somewhere around there. After it's done, you can cut it back by half and you'll get a second set of blooms by the fall, which is nice. The second set is not going to be as good, but it's still going to give you some nice color. But a very unique blue color, and the photos really don't do it justice, unfortunately. But this is the Salvia Blue Bayou. The height, the overall height is probably about 24 inches tall, maybe 30 inches with the flowers themselves. Really nice dark green foliage, but this is a bee magnet. So there are bees on this plant all the time, and the bees love the salvia. So the salvias are in the mint family, but don't let that scare you. These are not invasive. They're a nice clump forming plant and really outstanding color. So again, it's more blue than the purple as the photograph looks. But just know that Salvia Blue Bayou, that's one I'm definitely adding to my garden this summer. And I'll wrap it up before I take those couple questions in the chat is if you do want more gardening classes, there is so much available. So I'll point you to our horticulture blog, which is just csuhort.blogspot.com. Know that we have started a 9-week free gardening series that started 2 weeks ago. They are held on Fridays at noon through May 14th, and you can see the list of topics. You do have to register. It's a very easy process, just your name and email address. You get the Zoom confirmation. You just click and join us on Fridays at noon. If you can't join us live, just know that we do record these classes and then they're posted on the cohorts blog. All of our classes that we've been doing remotely since a year ago are all posted on the blog. And so if there's something that you want to learn about or a niche that you maybe want to consider, those classes are posted and we'd encourage you to do that. But do check out these classes. They all start at noon on Fridays through May 14th and taught by extension agents like myself and some of our specialists as well, like Dr. Koski, who's doing spring lawn care this Friday. So that is all I have, and let me pull up the chat and I will get to those questions. So, so Mary had asked, like, will you mess up the perennials by dividing at the wrong time or just lose some bloom time? Mary, that is such a great question. And yes, you'll just maybe not get blooms that year. But if it's convenient to you to divide them in the spring, but that means that you're dividing them when they are blooming, that's fine. You know, we have to work with our own schedules. Just know that it is stressful to be blooming and then be divided at the same time. So just give them some extra water, TLC, and help them get established. Christy asks, our raspberries are diminishing in production. They're increasingly getting shaded. Does the too much shade reduce production? Absolutely. And sometimes raspberries, they just get tired. So you might need a refresh. So that might mean digging out part of your raspberries and then replenishing them with some new canes. That might help. But definitely the shade. Those are full sun plants and they also need a lot of water. So when they are in flower and fruit, you're looking at probably 2 inches of water a week. So that might be also impacting some of the production of the raspberries. With peonies, when do you divide or move peonies? Ooh, okay, so here's the thing about peonies is that they never want to be moved. They never want to be divided. They are very, very fussy. So I would say, first of all, only move them if you absolutely have to move them. There has to be a really good reason. You would move them though in the spring, so nowish is the time that you would move or divide them. And when you do this, you have to make sure that you replant them exactly the same height that they were before you touch them. These are plants that get really pouty. They may not bloom for you for 5 to 7 years after dividing. They just really, once they find their spot, they just leave them. They're kind of a diva. Just respect them. But if you need to move them because, again, like you have too much shade or something like that, you can make that decision. But again, patience is key with the peonies and making sure that you are doing it exactly as they were because they were happy there. So try to replicate those conditions. Lisa asks, when you cut back the suggested plants in the fall, how late? And then do you cut them all the way to the ground? So yeah, try to get as close to the ground as possible. With our ornamental grasses, you know, that's virtually impossible to do. So 2 to 4 inches with your ornamental grasses is just fine. In terms of how late, you could do it in November. You know, if you have Thanksgiving and you want to go outside and it's a nice day and cut back some perennials, you could absolutely do that. Just know that probably I would try to get most of that done by the end of November, because that's generally when our soils start to freeze. So December, January, somewhere in there is maybe not the best time, because we're getting into that really dry period of time. But you know, if your coneflowers, if you left those in the fall and by January you're just over it, you can go ahead and cut those back as well. With your peonies, cut those all the way down to the ground. Catmint, exactly. Iris, generally, you could leave about 2 to 3 inches of a height, and then they'll happily rebloom for you next year. Nancy is ready to go shopping. Good for you. I will say that the Gardens on Spring Creek is having their annual plant sale this year. It's very similar to what they did last year. So know that there is a, you would buy your plants and then do curbside pickup. So it's not going to be a come in and shop for your plants, but they are having it, and it's, I believe, right around Mother's Day weekend. Kathy, great question. Will last year's ash from our fires change the soil this year? It won't. You know, ash is really not, the only thing that it really affected last year is if it got on plant surfaces, it could have reduced photosynthesis. Also, if you had any leafy greens that it got on, you would want to wash that off. But in terms of overall soil composition, it's not going to affect anything. No. Okay. Any other questions, Mary? Lisa wants to know how you get the CSU All-Stars. So I will, let me, actually, that's a great thing. Let me pull up that website for you really fast, or just visit, it's just Flower Trials. I'll type it in. So it's just flowertrials.colostate.edu. You can see the list of winners. So you can see all the winners from the annual trials and the perennial trials. And these plants should be available again at your local garden centers like Gully's, Fort Collins Nursery. And you can go ahead and ask them by name, but they should be readily available because CSU does a big promotional push of releasing them, and you should be able to find them. But shop early, that would be my suggestion. And I spelled that wrong. It's Flower Trials with an S, so Flower Trials. That's what I get for trying to type while speaking. There you go, flowertrials.colostate.edu.